defining war aims is a tricky thing because you have to convince a public. You have to speak to an audience, and sometimes the nuances are not clear because you have to rally support. And it's easy to say about this war that the aim is to destroy the nuclear program and the ballistic missiles program, which is sort of true, but the idea that you can destroy them finally and forever is ridiculous because you can start a new nuclear program. You can get a bomb within 3 years if nothing interferes with your plan, starting from scratch. So even if you take everything, they can do it again. So I think the better way to define the major aim of the war is to teach this regime that the price of maintaining a nuclear program is unbearable for them. It's unrealistic. They can't stand it because we will keep destroying their economy, their ability to rule, their symbols of state. Now, of course, we would like that regime to fall, but engineering regime change is a major difficult task, and from the air, it's even more complicated. So if there was no time limits, if democratic publics were patient enough, then this war is a major step towards the fall of this regime, which may still take time. They may still need to be suffocated economically and repeatedly beaten down. And it may not be as we say in Hebrew, bang v'gamanu, one hit and that's all. It may not work like that. And I think both Trump and Netanyahu have begun to adjust their messages to this probable outcome. I've heard American pundits say that Trump's aim is no longer regime change, and I don't think that's true. I think Trump may no longer think that this can be achieved in a very short period of time. And of course, Trump is not inclined to send American troops into Iran, which is, if you want to secure regime change, you need some force. And a defenseless crowd against machine guns is probably not going to do this. So either you arm that crowd in some way, or you send your own troops, and that's such a trauma now for the American public that I don't think an American president can risk that. But even if the war stopped tomorrow, and then there would be huge disappointment because the expectations were very high, even if that happens, it still achieved a great deal. Because if you think of the larger picture, the Middle East has been completely transformed since the days of Obama or the days before October 7th. It's now, the Middle East was an arena where America's allies were increasingly cornered, and Iran and its proxies and its backing from Russia and China were ascendant. And Iran was on the way to regional hegemony. And now it's beaten down. All its proxies have been, if not eliminated, then severely weakened. That and more, Israel now has the explicit backing of the United States, which has made a serious declaration that it is not going to leave this region in the hands of the Chinese-Russian axis. Iran was to China what Hezbollah was to Iran. Hezbollah was Iran's way to create a front guard with a border with Israel, which does not have a border with Iran. And so this advanced guard was the guarantor of Iran's nuclear program, because it was supposed to guarantee that the price for Israel's going to war with Iran would be unbearable for Israel. This was the strategic picture that we had before October 7, and major Israeli politicians, though never Netanyahu, began to say that Israel is going to have to learn to live with a nuclear Iran. That includes Ehud Barak and other leaders of the liberal opposition. The idea that we can live with a nuclear Iran rests on the assumptions of the Cold War and the thought that Iran could be deterred in the same way that the Soviet Union could be deterred by the United States. So Israel is the United States and Iran is the Soviet Union, and so a nuclear balance could be achieved. But this is not the Soviet Union. This is a fanatic, ultra-religious, fundamentalist regime. And this is a culture which encourages martyrdom from individuals. So how do you know that it doesn't harbor the same sentiments regarding nations, especially that if you look into their Shiite theology, then Armageddon and nuclear Armageddon is the beginning of the end of days and of redemption and the triumph of Islam. So how about calculating your risks when you have someone who may be eager for a nuclear catastrophe? And the idea that we can live with it is ridiculous. And then you look at the larger chessboard, and I'm stunned by. I don't mean Tucker Carlson and other cookies. I mean reasonable people like Rand Paul, who think that it is not America's interest to neutralize this danger to world peace. And they don't understand that this is a direct American interest. I think what happened, if you look at the smaller regional picture, is that many more people now realize that the interests of the United States and Israel are actually aligned. And the message, Netanyahu has been hammering this forever, saying, quoting Churchill or paraphrasing Churchill, saying, give us the tools and we'll finish the job, because we are the front line of this civilizational clash. And I think that the war also will have huge influence on the global culture wars, because what we see in academia now and the hostility to Zionism, the postcolonial paradigm, basically says that Zionism is the rearguard action of a bygone, evil, defunct 19th century politics of colonialism and nationalism. And now in this global world, Zionism epitomizes the bad old times. That's what you'd study if you go to a university, and this is why all these students who don't know which river and which sea still think that Zionism is evil, because this is the picture of the world that they get, and Zionism is to serve as the whipping boy for the West's sins, and the West generally has to bow down before other cultures and ask their apology. That's one worldview. And the other worldview, this is Edward Said. And if you think, who's Edward Said's opposite number in the intellectual world? And I'd say it's Benjamin Netanyahu. Because if you look at Benjamin Netanyahu's speeches, first of all, this is people, I don't know if people outside Israel realize that this is an intellectual. Netanyahu is by far the best read politician in Israel. And he thinks in these terms. His father is a historian. And if you look at his speeches, and apart from rallying support for Israel and all that, the ideological framework that they put forth says that Zionism is not the rearguard action of the bad old West. It is the spearhead of the front of Western civilization in its war with barbarism. And he quoted in his speech before Congress, the joint session of the two houses, he referred to Samuel Huntington and the clash of civilizations when he said it's not a clash of civilizations. It's a clash of civilization and barbarism. So this is explicitly designed to counter the idea that Zionism is all that's bad with the West. It's the other way around. We can serve as an example for the West to wake up from its slumbers. And this is why Netanyahu emphasized that our war with Hamas is your war in Saint-Denis, in Paris, in Neukölln, in Berlin, in Malmö, in Sweden, where the West has lost its courage to answer its detractors, and as usual, the Jews are just the canary in the mine. Because if you don't realize that the attack on Jews is an attack on Western civilization, then you don't understand the picture. And the picture is, if I can use a phrase from Tommy Robinson, I interviewed him here. There was a controversy over that, whether or not we should endorse him. But he keeps saying, after Saturday comes Sunday, you are next. This attack on the Jews is the attack on the principles of Western civilization. And it's not for the first time. If you look at Adolf Hitler's war on the Jews was more important. This was World War II was a war against the Jews. And he wouldn't say it publicly, but he did say it, that the Christians are next, not in the sense that he was going to kill the Christians, but that Christianity is the bastard daughter of Judaism, the philosophy of the weak. And we, the wolves, the lions, the Aryans, we should fight these philosophies of weakness. Now, the Jews are incurable because they are weak, and so they introduce this germ into moral philosophy where you need to feel mercy for the weak. But the Christian idea that you should give the other cheek is a descendant of Judaism. And he said Christianity and National Socialism are not going to be able to live peacefully forever. So it's the same thing. And anti-Semitism is once again the forerunner of a general attack on Western culture, and our universities are reproducing this as an autoimmune disease. They are, while Islam is attacking Western civilization, Westerners are saying, yes, come cleanse us from our sins by bowing down before you. We humble ourselves, and you're not humbling yourself. You're giving up your moral fiber. You're giving up the what do you call the internal part of the bone?
The marrow.
The marrow of your moral bone. That's what you're giving up. You're giving up your spine. And you see these people again and again. Look at an anti-Semite like Tucker Carlson. Where does he end up? With the mullahs of Iran, with the neo-Nazis. And it's him, and and it goes down the line with people who are weak of mind and of character. And the problem is not always the Tucker Carlsons. It's the Megyn Kellys of the world who are, for clicks, will just follow that because they think where the wind is going. And they are on a trajectory to support Iran. And it's the same thing in Israel. In Israel, who are those who object to the war? Those who would not learn the lesson of October 7th.
In the 80s, mutually assured destruction was the deterrence for a nuclear war. And what you have pointed to is that the destruction of an Islamist state is not necessarily
a deterrent.
What do you think happened in the mind of those in the West that there's sort of an amnesia about the possibility of a nuclear winter? That was like the whole rhetoric at the time.
I think time has lulled many people into a false sense of complacency, and that's not true of Israel. Israel destroyed the Iraqi nuclear program and then the Syrian nuclear program, and now it initiated the destruction of the Iranian nuclear program. Mind you that the ability to destroy it is because Netanyahu said on October 8th, he said, we are going to change the face of the Middle East. And I think we now see what he meant. And all through this progression, the left in Israel and the Biden administration were saying, we're trying to de-escalate Israel's war, and they kept warning that this may spiral into a regional war. While when you look back, Netanyahu was planning a regional war. That's what we needed. And if you remember our first conversation during the war, Pamela, I was very pessimistic, and I said it would take 10 years because we have to fight a series of wars. Apparently, Netanyahu had like beads, strung them all on a shorter string. And what we are seeing, and I was completely wrong about the timeline, but I was not wrong about the need to fight these wars. And I remember saying that the next war is going to be horrible. It's a war against Hezbollah. And after that, there will be a war against Iran, because we can't afford an Iranian nuclear program. But here and in the Israeli left and the American left and the Biden administration saying a regional war. War is bad. So you must prevent a regional war. And this is what we all fell for in the West. The idea that wars should be avoided at all costs. Well, if you live in the real world, then avoiding small wars means you'll have to fight bigger wars later. And
which is something like what Marco Rubio recently said. In fact, I think that it was a clip that circulated from 11 years ago.
In the Senate. And he said it would be worse later. And you will have to fight this war under an Iranian nuclear umbrella. And this is what Netanyahu has been warning us from, I think, for now 4 decades. And we have lost, and Israel certainly lost until October 7, the idea that attack is the most important form of defense. What Israel has been giving into is a peacenik philosophy in which, first of all, we are strong and we can withstand anything. And secondly, we can do it all by playing the defense and not offense. And this is not the Ben Gurion philosophy. The Ben Gurion philosophy says you go out to hunt your enemies before they are too strong. What was the big challenge of the first decade of Israel's existence? It's in 1955, Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of Egypt, who aspired to be the leader of a unified Arab nation, Pan-Arabism it was called, had a deal with the Soviets and achieved a military supremacy in the Middle East. It was called the Czech deal. Of course, the Czechs were under the Soviet influence, and they gave him the weapons, and Israel could not afford this. And in an agreement with France and Britain, it initiated the 1956, what in English is called the Suez War. We call it the Sinai War. And that war was a signal and a means, a signal that we would not tolerate Egyptian military advantage and a means to prevent it. And so the series of wars that we had to fight were at each junction aimed at preventing the Egyptian leadership from achieving a decisive edge in the military balance. And we went out and we rooted out our enemies before they became too strong. Ever since, I guess, the Oslo Accords, our generals have become peaceniks. They become supporter of Oslo, and they adopt all these slogans that are like they come from, I don't know, the hippies from the 60s. Violence doesn't solve anything. You have to be able to reach some compromise, and we don't understand fanaticism, and we don't understand you look at the Democrats. Obama is a community organizer from Chicago. And when you're a community organizer and a social worker and you meet the thug in the neighborhood, you hug him and give him some love and then you moderate them. But in realpolitik of international affairs, you don't hug the thug. You carry a big stick and you should show that you are ready to use it. And by the way, Trump did this in his first term too, when he attacked the Wagner forces in Syria. And people don't remember that. So he signaled from the first moment, I am willing to use force, while the slogans of the Democrats are always de-escalation. Any situation you de-escalate. No, sometimes you escalate, because if you de-escalate everything, then you lose your advantage in the logic of game theory. Because if you are never willing to escalate, then the other party achieved what is called escalation dominance. You will always be the weaker part. So you have to show that you're willing to escalate and that you're willing to take offensive action. And this is, I think, what was demonstrated in the Rising Line, the first round in June of the first war with Iran, in which America joined Israel. But now you have a joint American-Israeli war. And the psychological weight of this fact should be clear to everyone around the world. It's certainly clear to everyone in the region. Now, Israel goes in tandem with the strongest force in the world. The leaders of the American administration keep saying the two strongest air forces in the world. And so what this does to Israel's prestige, and prestige is deterrence, has completely changed the rules in the Middle East. One thing. And then physically, we have destroyed so much of the infrastructure of Iran's proxies, and more importantly, demonstrated the will to do it. Next time that you are going to build anything, know that the full force of Israel's wrath is going to land on your head, and that it is backed by the United States. And you know, Pamela, if you are not sentimental and not caught up in these games of purifying your own conscience and feeling guilty about, I don't know, Vietnam or maybe earlier, European colonialism, then you understand that a stronger America means a more peaceful world. Everything has been turned on its head here. We have a leadership, especially a prime minister, who became, after October 7th, very aggressive. And you have the military sabotaging the war effort. The military in Israel, Herzi Halevi, a classic Oslo product, prevented us from taking territory in Gaza by instead using the tactics of raids, which cost us many lives. In the Gaza war, instead of taking territory, our forces went into raids and then came out again. And
you mean instead of holding territory?
Instead of holding territory, there was a whole war strategy that we have failed to implement, which would have been much more effective. It's divided Gaza into discrete areas, evacuating citizens from each, and then applying a siege, which is a legal weapon, a legal means in modern warfare. In fact, it saves many lives. But instead of having an aggressive military, which the politicians hold back, we have aggressive politicians with the military sabotaging the war effort in the name of alleged or supposed peace. That they wanted to help the Biden administration return us to the two-state track, and so they had to prevent the occupation of Gaza. And you had an insubordinate military in the beginning of the war, which relied on support from the Americans to counter the will of elected politicians. As Dan Shiftan, whom you know is not a soft-spoken person, said, imagine America's situation if it had two more Israels, one near Venezuela and one near North Korea. The whole, because America has been signaling that, look, we are holding this Rottweiler on a leash and it's going to attack. So we are holding it back. And what Dan said is that the good thing with the Israeli Rottweiler is you don't have to tell it to attack. It's eager to do it on its own because it recognizes, it smells the enemies. And this is how Israel should behave, because this is how you maintain peace. You do not maintain peace by appeasing. This is amazing that after Munich in the 30s, we still have to remind people that appeasing the Hitlers of the world is a recipe for more death and more destruction. So this is why we want an aggressive military that's ready to fight when told, and that is brave. We could have attacked the nuclear program in the 2010s, but our generals and the head of the Mossad, Meir Dagan, when Israel was making plans to attack Iran, they went to Obama and they revealed the government's plan and therefore foiled them. This is what happens, and it's unforgivable because the generals in Israel think that they are the real proprietors of the state. They come from the old guard of the leadership and the hegemonic groups, and they should restrain the irresponsible politicians. That's how they see their jobs. They call it Shomer Saf, which is also the name of my podcast. Ironically, it's the name of my podcast. It's gatekeepers. They think of themselves as gatekeepers, saving us from wild politicians, not from the enemies. And this is how they behave. So
is it documented that
Oh, yeah.
they told Obama?
They foiled the plans for an attack on the Iranian regime. It's now Karen Glick had confronted them publicly with this in a panel. So yeah, it's well documented by now. It was the chief of staff and the head of Mossad. The chief of staff was General Gabi Ashkenazi, and the head of Mossad then was Meir Dagan, and he was proud of it. He was proud that he did it. He saved Israel from a regional war, apparently, and there is something deeply anti-democratic about it, because the public chooses their leadership, but the public is wild and it chooses irresponsible leaders. So the bureaucrats, the academics, the generals, they are here to act as responsible civil servants who would prevent the
will of the public,
the deplorable public from. But apparently, the deplorable public and the leaders it chooses is much better at preventing wars. And I think Trump is actually right when he says that if it was him, not Biden, in the White House, the Ukrainian war would never have started. They would not have messed with Trump because they consider him aggressive and also unpredictable, which was a policy applied by, Nixon. Tried to create a public persona of the mad president. He was the most calculated person in his actual policies, but he had this. He called it the mad president theory. The madman, I think, the madman theory of the president, or some such thing. And he said, and rightly so, the other side should think that I can be unpredictable and dangerous. That's a good deterrent.
Say more for people who aren't familiar with Oslo.
The left in Israel, the supporters of Oslo, including the generals, believe that the greatest danger for Zionism is demographic. And so a two-state solution will ensure that there would be a Jewish majority on one side of the border and an Arab majority on the other side. That is not an unreasonable concern, except that if you think of the other danger, the danger that you would have a territory that stretches from Tehran to the outskirts of Ben Gurion, with a mountain ridge overlooking Tel Aviv and a narrow strip of 9 miles of the beach until the mountain hill and until the foot of the mountains, then that is far more dangerous and immediate. So, but in their mind, the two-state solution is the way to save Zionism from binationalism, to save us from a binational state and what they see as permanent civil war.
Explain what a binational state would be.
A binational state would be a state where there are two peoples who are at war with each other. Usually, non-national states don't survive. It's not just democracies. If you look at any multinational state that does not have a unifying identity that all feel part of, then these structures like Yugoslavia, they don't survive.
Most people think of a national state as being just a country. Like, most people don't think in terms of what a nation is as a people. So when people hear binational state, they can sometimes think that it means two governing bodies as opposed to two peoples in one.
Two nations.
Yeah.
It's a binational state is a state that encompasses two peoples, each of which seek independence
and self-determination.
And self-determination, and lacking that would try to impose their own polity on the other nation and become the proprietors of the place at the expense of the other nation. And Americans are especially prone to misunderstanding because it's easy to sell to Americans a misleading image of themselves as not one nation, but rather a multicultural society in which there are Italians, Irish people, Africans, Jews, Hispanics, and other cross sections of identity. While in America, the dominant identity is American, and all the others are subcategories of American. That's not the case in Israel. That's not the case in most nation states, and most nation states have minorities within them who do not feel they want to assimilate into the host nation. So almost all nation states have national minorities. That is, minorities who do not belong to the nation and want to preserve their separate identity. So the danger. So as long as you have a minority, that's one thing. But if you have two more or less similar in size national bodies, then you have the same problem that you have with religions. When Voltaire said that if you have one religion, it would become a tyranny. If you have two religions, it would be a civil war. If you have 30 religions, you will have a thriving civil society, because no minority would think of itself, would aspire to rule the others. And if everyone is a minority, then minority rights become the common denominator of all that they can agree on. So you have an Oslo framework in politics, but this is just part, although it was the engine of a whole misconception of the conflict. You have what we call the conceptia, the defunct, misleading paradigm that Israel's elites clung to. And when I say elites, I mean you could hardly escape it, because it would be taught as truth in universities. It would be the only thing you would hear in the press. It would be the sign of being civilized in politics, where everyone who does not agree with the politics, with the political paradigm, is a fascist or an idiot or a crazy man.
And what was that conceptia?
And so I'd say that conceptia was like a Matryoshka Russian doll, because it had various layers and they were all mutually dependent. So if you start from the bottom, then like at the most a tactical level, you see how the army behaves. And the army adopted a conception of technological defense. That is, we would hide behind technological walls. We will create an iron dome which will intercept incoming projectiles, and we will have the slurry wall, the wall that you can't dig under, with all these sensors and automatic shooting systems. And so you will rely on superior technology and the idea that you can play defense. That conception draws on and is related to the idea of separation between Israelis and Palestinians. So the wall is almost a palpable metaphor for the idea that they will be there and we will be here. We would separate. And this is encompassed in the idea of separation would mean peace. So in the end, you have peace between two national bodies. And that is rooted in the ideas that they are like us, that we understand them based on our experience of Zionism. And the aim of Zionism was political independence for the Jews. And so they also aspired to political independence. So when they have a state, they will be satisfied like we were. Of course, they may want a larger state, but the state is the center of their political aspirations. And that idea is rooted in a more general philosophy of human nature, in which I will say it in the Obama or Yistel, in the Obama idiom. Everyone wants a decent job, to put food on the table, and to raise their children in a safe environment. And it's very appealing. It's because you look at yourself, you look at your neighbors, and you think that's what everybody wants. But that's not what they want. That's not what a mother who says she has raised her kids to be martyrs, and she would be proud if they die for the cause. That's not the same as what you imagine everyone to be. So there is an assumption on human nature. There is an assumption on political movements. There is an assumption of which in the end leads to a sort of planning in the military, which is an echo of all this Matryoshka doll. And that was the fact that the breach of the fence, and there was a general who said they were supposed to come underground. So we built this wall so they can't dig tunnels. We didn't expect them to come with bulldozers to the fence. It's like they broke the rules.
Or fly over it.
Or fly over it. So in one day, all the Matryoshka doll collapsed. And we saw, all the way to the philosophical assumptions. Because when you hear someone slaughtering a family and ecstatically reporting this live as it happens to his family, then you realize, no, they are not like you. They are not like you. If you take a Westerner and put them in a Nukhba unit and send them to slaughter children, they would not be able to do it. What I mean is not that they will be conscientious objectors. I mean they would faint if just in the sight of this. They would vomit and be unable to execute it because the way you are brought up and the way they were brought up is so radically different that you have to be a little more humble and think you do not really understand these people.
So I want to go back to what the Oslo framework actually said and what it was. And second, given that these Russian nesting dolls all collapsed, how was it that the generals so quickly went right back into the Oslo framework in their thinking about what to do in Gaza? And then the third thing is, surely not everybody in Gaza or in the West Bank is of that mentality. And those are the people many focus on, the people who are essentially held hostage by Hamas. I don't know exactly how that works in the West Bank with the Palestinian Authority, but there's a new news service coming out of Gaza that's an anti-Hamas news service that's reporting on what Hamas has been doing to the Palestinians. So I don't know if there's any data on what the percentage is of people in...
Overwhelming majority rejoiced on October 7th. Overwhelming majority.
And now?
This culture, its values are not like ours. In the West Bank, the only figures to be revered are people who killed Jews. if you have a school that's named after someone, a square that's named after someone, a street, a hospital, they're all named on terrorists. And there's a pay-for-slay program in which, and I remind you that Mahmoud Abbas said that if you suffocate the Palestinian Authority economically, it would use its last dollars to support the families of martyrs.
I think he said to the last penny.
To the last penny, he would support the families of martyrs. That is, killing Jews was and remains the highest value. And
but that's the leadership. How pervasive is that?
But if you teach people from kindergarten that's the value, the system of values, then that's what happens. Look, the Hamas terrorists grew up on Palestinian Authority school books. If you study school books, then from kindergarten, but certainly from reading age, when you have books, everything is geared to dehumanizing Jews. So that when you do your grammar lesson, and this is an actual example, then you would teach the diacritics, the way the dots above and below. Examples would be, it is forbidden to think of the occupiers as human. That is the sentence for which it would be used in grammar. And if you go to the what they have for scouts, then they take you at age, 13, to witness the execution of traitors. And this, it's a violent culture everywhere. Everywhere in the Arab world, violence is far more pervasive than in the West, and Palestinian culture is probably the worst and the most extreme and the most radical. But look at, Hassan al-Banna, look at the teachings of the Muslim Brotherhoods. The glorification of death is a major feature of their theology. So I'm not inclined to think that the Palestinian population is a hostage of a radical sect in the same way that communism hijacked Russian society. I don't think it's the same thing. I think it's a grassroots thing. Hamas, remember, won the elections, and what they did is immediately execute Fatah and their
That was 20 years ago.
And if they've only tightened their grip on the population since, and on the population's mind, no less than, I think, on the population technically. Now people may be waking up because the destruction that this war brought on Gaza and the price we exacted was a major deterrent. You've also learned that the ridiculous accusations of genocide have been now disproven by Hamas itself, because we know what it pays to the families of its own combatants. And now you suddenly see that the ratio of non-combatants to combatants, despite their extreme efforts to put citizens in harm's way, still we achieved what is probably the lowest ratio of civilians to combatant deaths in a modern urban warfare. So
do you know what the ratio is?
It's between 1-to-1 and 2-to-1. I think in Raqqa and in Mosul, the coalition campaign, it was between 7-to-1 and 9-to-1 civilians per combatant. So there was no army in the history of the world that made such efforts to protect civilians. And mind you that we still have philosophers who say, well, if civilians are killed, you should stop the war. This is the argument of all those who said, oh, Israel is killing all these people. Israel is not going to give up victory in this war. And you should know that if you hide behind citizens, first of all, it's your war crime that they died, and we will not stop attacking because you are hiding behind civilians. And imagine the moral short-sightedness of those saying, oh, if innocent people are going to get killed, then you have to stop the war. What this means is that you teach the other side is that this is a useful tactic to hide behind civilians. What we should teach them is that will not save you. That we will hunt you nevertheless, and in the long run, this reduces harm to civilians rather than increasing it.
this leads me back to the question about Oslo. So what was the framework? What did it stipulate, and how did it fail?
Oslo assumed that the Palestinians wanted political independence and a Palestinian state, and that therefore separation between the two peoples would lead to peaceful coexistence. What it didn't take into account is that the Palestinian national movement, their national ethos, is radically different from ours, and the center of their ethos is the destruction of the Jewish state, not the independent state for the Palestinians. From the first, they were never engaged in nation building. What they did was create and export chaos. They never created order and sovereign institutions at home. They became a collection of warring tribes and competing security apparatuses, which was comfortable for Arafat. It's comfortable for the dictatorships often, because we think of dictatorships as more orderly, but it's not necessarily so, because the dictator has to have the factions fighting with each other to keep the dictator as the arbiter of all conflict. Oslo assumed that instead of directly tackling the most controversial issues, which are borders, refugees, and Jerusalem, which bring too much emotional baggage into the negotiations, we will start with security patrols, with water infrastructure, and municipal management. And so gradually the Palestinians will learn to rule their own populations, and we will develop trust by solving small problems. This is a very American way of thinking about things. We will get into the habit of solving problems together, and after we achieve mutual trust, we can tackle the larger problems and reach compromises. And what it did was the exact opposite. The more friction there was, the more both sides realized at the ground level how at odds they were, and we started seeing buses exploding. And the Israeli leadership kept, they called the victims of terrorism, they called them korbanot hashalom, the victims of peace. And they kept saying, the radicals on both sides are not going to prevent us from moving forward. And what they never took into account is that, yes, in Israel there's a radical wing and most of us are moderate, but there is no moderate faction on the other side. There's no peace now among the Palestinians. There was no peace movement. There was no leadership ever calling to compromise on the larger issues. And so Oslo did not create trust. It just created greater friction. And then came Ehud Barak and said, we'll cut the Gordian knot. And here is a full proposal for a partition of the land and even a partition of Jerusalem. And Arafat rejected that. And this is when most Israelis, myself included still, I was originally a supporter of Oslo. I believed the press, I believed the conceptia, the paradigm. And then I said, well, if there's not going to be peace, then let's just partition without peace. Because the democratic argument is also the demographic argument. If we want a Jewish state, we need a Jewish majority. If we want a Jewish majority, we need to retain a territory in which there is a stable Jewish majority. And so we had to partition the land and unilaterally withdraw from Gaza. And then rockets kept raining from Gaza, which was a first sign that they are not interested. Gaza was the pilot of a Palestinian state. And what did they do in Gaza? Did they do nation buildings? No, they built terrorist infrastructure. And there's such a perfect metaphor for this. You have all these bulldozers and all this concrete. And instead of building shelters for your population, you build tunnels for your warriors. That's what they invested the money in, because they don't want political independence. They want the whole of the land of Israel, and they want what they call the right of return of the refugees, which is not a right, is not a return, and these are no longer refugees. But what they mean is the destruction of Israel demographically. And so I thought, let's build a wall. They will be there. We will be here. And so they shoot some rockets at us. And then we realized that the rockets we realized that in the Lebanon war, because we got rockets from Hezbollah, we suddenly realized rockets can be a real problem. Because Qassam rockets in the beginning were harassment. They were not a strategic problem, but they became a strategic problem. And so in October 7, we got the final lesson that unilateral withdrawal would get us nowhere, because they would build a terrorist infrastructure. And if they do that in Judea and Samaria are steeply, it's a mountain ridge overlooking where we are sitting now. They can shoot directly from there, because it's in the light of sight. It's not even a ballistic trajectory. So Judea and Samaria is 15 times more than Gaza. And if it will have a territorial a continuity all the way to Iran, which has been supplying the Palestinian Authority with weapons, and Hamas with weapons, and smuggling them into the West Bank, then what happened on October 7 would be child's play relative to what they can do from the West Bank, 10 minutes away from Tel Aviv. And under the Oslo framework, we agreed for them to have a police force, because the idea was that we would outsource Jewish security to Arab policemen in the Palestinian Authority. And Rabin said that they would be more effective against Hamas because they don't have human rights NGOs and a Supreme Court. Bli Bagatz v'bli B'Tselem, he said. Without the Supreme Court, without the human rights organizations, which meant that, Arafat will deal with terrorists in the Arab way. They will disappear in some cellar and they will be executed without any judicial process. And so the idea was that they will take care of their terrorists. Instead, they team up with them. We now have reports, which, we don't speak Arabic, most of us, which is regrettable. This is how we keep imagining them as we want them to be instead of how they are. But those who do speak Arabic, like the Regavim movement, who produced this report called Policemen by Day, Terrorists by Night, the spokesman for the Palestinian Authority brag that PLO personnel kill more Jews in Judea and Samaria than Hamas does. That is the way they brag to their own population. And we thought they have a police force. They don't. They go to Pakistan. They do parachute training. They do artillery training. They get armored vehicles. And this is 10 minutes away from where we are sitting right now. And still the Shabak is pretending that the problem with Judea and Samaria is the settler violence. Settler violence is 90%. This is a precise number. It's 90% myth and 10% exaggerations.
Surely there is some.
What is interesting about settler violence is how little there is of it. Regavim has also checked the United Nations database.
What's Regavim?
And the Regavim report. I can send you the English version of the Regavim report. What the report has shown is that 90% of the cases cited there, 90% are ridiculous. What do they count as settler violence? This can range from a pilgrimage to the Temple Mount. That's settler violence, even with no incident. They count that as settler violence. They count as settler violence cases of self-defense, like in the middle of a terrorist attack. If you shoot the terrorist committing the attack, that is counted as settler violence. So settler violence is mostly a bunch of lies financed lavishly by the European Union and other European governments who pay NGOs whom we know are lying. We know that breaking the silence are making things up. It's been proven that they are making things up, and they sent their activists to provoke soldiers and settlers into violence. So you would have the international media would show that he was in Haaretz. Had it not been so cynical and morbid, it would have just been funny. They report settlers going escorted by IDF soldiers to steal sheep from Palestinian herdsmen. And when you actually investigate, what happened is the Palestinians stole these sheep, and the army and the settlers went to get them back. So what you see in the media is the army entering a Palestinian village with wild settlers who steal sheep from Palestinians. And this is, there's a whole industry of lies. And why is there an industry of lies? Because if you admit that the real problem in the territories is Palestinian terrorism, which is vastly more numerous, the incidents are more numerous, and they are vastly more violent. Vastly. This is not, it's not a matter of small differences. Settlers in Judea and Samaria live under constant danger for their lives. And sometimes they fight back. Sometimes. Mostly they don't fight back. And they've been complaining for years that the army is not protecting them. And the Shabak has been behaving, the Shin Bet, which is Unanbar was the head of the Shabak, these are the frontier of Oslo. These people were investigating their own government for Kahanism, unauthorized. You have a secret service spying on your elected politicians who are suspected of Kahanism, right-wing philosophy.
Shabak, Shin Bet, is the secret service.
Is the secret service.
And Kahanism is...
Followers of Meir Kahane, who was the head of a racist party and was banned from the Knesset. The idea that the right in Israel is infested with racist Kahanism is completely ridiculous. The Shin Bet thought that the police was not forceful enough in its enforcement on settlers. There's Palestinian encroachment into Area C all the time, backed by Palestinian security forces, and you know that in Judea and Samaria, Israelis can't go into Area A.
Right.
They will not come back.
Right.
So if you travel through Judea and Samaria, there are big red signs that say, if you're an Israeli, don't turn right here because we can't guarantee your security and the rest of it. So there's certainly friction. There is settler violence. There is. But there is a vested interest in blowing that up because that is what preserves the hope of peace. The whole idea, look, the left has collapsed here because Israelis mostly realize there is no partner for peace on the other side. There just isn't. There's no peace movement. They're not willing to give up the right of return. They're not willing to allow any sovereign existence of Jews anywhere in the land of Israel. So Israelis turn their back on the idea of peace. But the left has the Oslo establishment has a vested interest in saying, no, it's not because of the Palestinians that we don't have peace. It's because of the Jewish terrorists. It's Jewish terrorism is what's provoking the Palestinian, and there is something consoling about that thought, right? Because if it's up to us, then there's still something we can do.
There's hope.
And there is no hope, and you should wean yourself off the idea that the Palestinians are peaceful. They're not. And we have to look the danger in the eye because we thought the same thoughts about Gaza. Look at Shin Bet on the eve of look. People in New York read Ronen Bergman in the New York Times, so they have no idea of what's actually happening. So they read Ronen Bergman and say, all the security apparatuses, they warned Netanyahu, and he ignored it. They never warned Netanyahu. They were in the days of the reform, they were trying to threaten Netanyahu in order to stop the reform. So they kept saying, this is the reform is creating civil strife in Israel, and our enemies will identify that the opportunity in order to attack us, and not saying that with the opportunity that the enemies were identifying was refuseniks in the army, people who refused to serve in the army in order to fight the reform, and they thought the army was collapsing. So They were the arsonists screaming fire, and that is framed as a warning. On the eve of the Gaza attack, we have the Shabak opinions from a week before, from 2 days before, and they were saying the Palestinians are moving to moderation. Hamas is becoming pragmatic. What Israel should do is make more economic concessions because our system is working, and they will not, and they will not risk escalating into violence. So until how can you convince people that the security establishment was warning Netanyahu and the government from an attack that they were not ready for? They did nothing to prepare for an attack. So how can you sell the idiotic lie to anyone that they were warning us from the imminent attack? So these are all spins and with agendas behind them. But the larger spin, or the larger agenda, is if you want to preserve the hope for peace, you have to convince yourself that it's up to you. And so in order to convince yourself that it's up to you, you need to blame yourself, not the other side. Because once you see what the other side does, you realize it's not up to us, and there is not going to be peace. There can be deterrence, and this is what we should do. And my political awakening far preceded October 7, when I realized that rockets are going to be a major problem, and I thought we cannot afford to evacuate Judea and Samaria. We have one geographical barrier between us and the larger Arab world, and my awakening came from phenomenon like ISIS and Al Qaeda. Ever since the Arab Spring, I realized that this region is political lava that only sprouts radical, crazy violence. And so look, the Arab world it's a civilizational collapse. It's a sad and terrible thing, but it's first, from an Israeli perspective, it's first and foremost dangerous. No political principle of order has survived in the Arab world. Pan-Arabism, Nasser, Arab socialism, monarchies, nation states, Ba'ath, nothing ever was stable except the tribe. Stable Arab regimes are states that are based on a tribe or else on a coalition of tribes that cooperates, like the Arab Emirates. But all other formulas have collapsed. And in the Arab Spring, what we saw was that nation states collapsed. So how come, after you see that nationalism is not a feasible principle of order in the Arab world, why do you think that the Palestinians, who are arguably the youngest people, and I'm being generous, some say are not a people at all, they're not a nation in the Western sense, why do you think that when they have a nation state, that will stabilize anything? And first of all, they're saying that it won't. And secondly, look at the experience of this region. So the political conclusion from the collapse of the peace process, then the collapse of the idea of unilateral withdrawal with disengagement, and then the collapse of nation states, that I think should have taught us the lesson that we cannot give up the Jordan Valley or the mountain ridge. We need this. The problem with Israel is people outside Israel don't realize how tiny it is, but you cannot have the center of your country, a 9-mile wide strip of beach under mountains overlooking it that would be dominated by a hostile force. We will not survive. And so I used to mock the right way of their paranoia when they called it the Auschwitz borders. Such borders will make us vulnerable to the next Holocaust.
Just to remind the audience, Area A is Arab controlled. There are no Jews there.
Yeah.
Area B is Arab controlled administratively and security is controlled by Israel.
Yeah.
And Area C is completely Israel.
Completely controlled by Israel.
What you said about it's easier to blame yourself, it's easier to say
It's consoling to blame yourself.
it's our fault, so therefore there's something we can do about it. You're making me think that this is also the thinking in the West.
Sure. Absolutely.
So say more about that.
The way Israel looks at Oslo and the Palestinians is a case of a more general phenomenon that is how the West looks at the other. The West doesn't see the other, is not interested in the other. The West is busy with its own construction of the other, because that makes you think that everything's up to you, and that the world is an arena of moral judgment where you should prove and then grandstand your moral purity. And so you are not engaged in solving problems, but rather in dealing with your own conscience. And usually, and this is a lesson of my father, self-righteousness is the opposite of morality. It almost always leads to immoral decisions. So that the self-righteous are not right.
You have a particular level of expertise in postmodern philosophy. You're making me think exactly of the postcolonial idea that everything that's wrong in the world is a result of white and sometimes settler colonialism.
Yeah. How narcissistic is that, to think that everything wrong in the world is your fault? It's you. You did everything. There's no role for others at all. And so this is, I always think, this is arrogant, and this is what's called the soft bigotry of low expectations. The others just react. Nothing is their fault. They don't have agency. You have all the agency. And so this is how you would expect God to think of himself, right?
Or
I did everything.
Or infants. I mean, you just made me think that this is an infantile narcissism where infants don't understand the distinction between themselves and other people. Did it start with Edward Said?
No, it started from the idea of social construction, I think, and the idea that language creates the world rather than depicts the world. And the architect of the whole thing is Michel Foucault. It's the origin of everything. And I think Michel Foucault's many disciples never understood him, because he's not a Marxist, he's a Nietzschean. And he wants Sturm und Drang. He wants fire and violence. And in a way, Foucault's personal struggle is sort of heroic. But if you look at Foucault's philosophy, it's an attempt to project your emotional difficulties on the world. And if you want to write, I thought if you would write a screenplay where Foucault is your protagonist, then Foucault lived in a culture that called him a pervert. And his revenge was to dismantle this whole culture and to delegitimize the idea of norms and of morality. And as a personal struggle, that's heroic. As a philosophy, it's very childish, because the ideal that Foucault was striving for, his ideal of freedom, as Gilles Deleuze once said, is not something you can talk about. It's not something you can even whistle about, because anything that is structure is anathema to his idea of freedom. So even identity is being identical to yourself. You must rebel against even yourself to be completely structureless, so that you are just a form of energy in motion. And that is, how are you going to take care of children if you're going to be energy in motion? What is this offer you except fire and violence. And I grew up with instinct against this, because when I first saw the film Woodstock, I was a teenager, and I had long hair, and I was a drummer in a band, and all that, and free love and all all that jazz. And my father said, "That's very nice, all these communes, but who's going to be their dentist?" And that completely collapsed it for me. That and another thing is, I was in love with this girl in my class, and the idea of free love and sharing her with everybody seemed atrocious to me. Never mind that she didn't notice I exist. So it was a long way until I had to, until any situation where I would have to share with anything. But I was in love, and I thought, this can't be reconciled with love. And any form.
Not to mention, she might not want to share herself with everybody.
Yeah. I read this. It's a wonderful book by Gadi Taub called "Thy Neighbor's Wife," in which he was blown away by the sexual revolution, and he convinced his wife to embark on this journey of communes and free love. And then they went to this commune, and she fell in love with the head of the commune, and then he was just devastated. And that's the lesson of that. But you can only practice this as a single rebel. You cannot generalize it. So you don't defy a certain form of moralism. You defy the algebra of moral thinking, because you defy the categorical imperative. You want to live a life which cannot be generalized. So you want to be exempt from everybody else. But Foucault didn't want to be exempt. He wanted to dismantle the whole system and then let chaos rule. So in a sense, he's the most radical romantic. And then came his disciples, which are shallow like Edward Said. And what they understood is that Foucault is fighting for the rights of the mentally impaired. Like his book on psychiatry was an attempt to, it was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It's like, let's liberate all these interesting, inspired people from the tyranny of psychiatry. And those who came after him saw the idea of social construction as a liberatory philosophy, where we will liberate everyone from tyrannic discourse, which has been disciplining us all. So they read Foucault's Discipline and Punish, and their conclusion was the world would be more democratic and more equal if we dismantle all these structure of discourse. So Edward Said was bringing justice to the Arab world. He was not. Edward Said convinced Western Orientalists to look at themselves instead of looking at the Orient. That's all he did. And when you see the political implication, what was MESA, I think they're called, the National Organization of the Middle Eastern Studies, their first reaction to the call by George W. Bush to recruit, by his administration, to recruit people for courses in Arabic was, don't learn Arabic from the colonial, this is a colonial enterprise, and don't go to study Arabic. So it's about studying yourself, right? Because what did Edward Said do? Edward Said, I was once fanatic enough to read the whole book and look for sentences who say something, say something about the Arab world. I counted like a handful. What is the book about? It's not about the Orient. It's about Orientalists only. It's about the discourse about the Orient. And now you judge everything by, is it flattering or not to the Orient? And of course, nothing is. So it's all colonialism. And you read a text, you do not ask whether this is true. You ask, what are the intentions of the writer? And so when I teach postmodern, it's very easy to teach, because once you get through the, horrible style of the Judith Butlers of the world, then you see it's always the same. It's like a sausage machine. No matter what you put into it, you get the same sausage, because they always move the discussion from politics to the politics of truth. And so you never ask what is true. You only ask who decides and for what purpose? And the answer is always the same. The hegemonic group decides in order to perpetuate its control. It's so narcissistic and it's so Western. There's no Arabic postmodernism. There's nothing of the sort. So if you look at anywhere, you look at postmodern feminism, they don't ask what a woman is, as Matt Walsh did. They ask who decides and for what purpose. And you never, the way that you evaluate a statement is not by asking, is it true, but by asking, what purpose does it serve? And so you are not allowed to say that in the Arab world, there was no enlightenment and there was no industrial revolution, and therefore the Arab world got left behind in the 20th century. You're not allowed to say that because saying that is racist. So you don't ask, is it true? You ask, what purpose politically does it serve? And so what it ends up doing is you're not allowed to say the truth. And so Obama's administration was never allowed to say Islamic terrorists. They were only allowed to say radical extremism or violent extremism. And so in the end, you are unable to solve problems in the world because you are not allowed to describe them.
This epistemology is designed to sow chaos. If there's nothing that's tethered to an objective world, you can't, there's nothing stabilizing. The second thing is, as you were talking, I was thinking exactly about the Hunter Biden laptop, which revolved around the same question. It wasn't, is it true? It's, what are the political implications? Who would it benefit to give this information? You know, same thing.
That's true. I didn't think of it.
Right? So the same thing operates in the world of dissemination of information.
You know how the Hunter Biden laptop was reported in the New York Times? Exactly like that. I may be paraphrasing slightly, but it's not far from what they said. Trump informed that information given by Giuliani may be Russian plant. That was how they reported the Hunter Biden laptop, because you remember the 51 veterans of the intelligence community produced this report, orchestrated by Anthony Blinken, by the way, that said that the appearance of the Hunter Biden laptop has all the earmarks of a Russian information operation. All the earmarks. They haven't seen it, but that was their opinion. But for your first remark, I think that the purveyors of this boring, infantile, repetitive, postmodern project don't think of themselves, as Foucault did, as sowing chaos. First of all, Foucault did not think that the psychiatrists were taking over the world. He thought that psychiatric discourse was creating discipline or effects of power, and that the psychiatrists are as trapped in it as everybody else. His disciples were more simplistic, and their formulae is always that the psychiatrists are ruling the world. So in Edward Said, it's the Orientalists are ruling the world or belong to the group that rules the world. And for the postmodern feminists, it's the males who rule the world. But they always have a personification of the discourse. So it's much less sophisticated than Foucault. But their aim was not Foucauldian, and I think they are deeply apolitical, and what they do is self-therapy. This is about feeling good about yourself by purifying yourself from the sins of your own culture. This is the game that academia keeps playing, and it does so by depoliticizing everything and creating the illusion that discourse is politics. It's not. Intellectuals are looking for the coin under the lamp. Is that an expression in English? It is in Hebrew. this is their work. They deal with discourse. And so this is the most important thing in the world. This
Oh, the
creates
coin under the,
the
they're
world.
looking, we do keys under the light, under the lamppost.
We do coins.
So what you're saying is you're looking for the thing where the light is instead of where it actually is.
Yeah. So you pretend that discourse is politics, but identity politics, I tell students, are the depoliticization of identity.
How do you mean the depoliticization?
Because what identities are sanctioned in identity politics? Theoretically, all identities except national identities. Why? Because nationalism is a discourse that aspires to a political institutionalization. So that if we speak in Foucauldian, and I think I'm quoting Michael Walzer more or less, the problem with nationalism is that it connects the discourse of identity to the mechanism of coercion. So the one thing we are, look, identity politics are inherently hostile to nationalism. That's the core of everything. So why are all identities fine? But because they want to make identities a personal creation or or something that is that floats in the civil sphere and is completely disconnected from politics. Because once you connect it to politics, it becomes oppressive. So national identity is an identity that seeks courts and armies and schools and mental institutions and everything else. And so this is identity becomes a kind of hobby. It becomes deeply depoliticized. While think of ourselves, Jews were striving after their bitter experience to politicize identity and to demand political independence for an identity group. What these people are doing are create identities are a performative art, which is politically divisive, but not politically effective ever. So it's better to say the depoliticization of identity than to say identity politics.
In essence, what you're saying is because the postmodern idea is what you call the depoliticization of identity, Zionism is a direct affront to that idea.
Of course.
And what these campus elites and intellectuals are responding to is a threat to their worldview. You're making me think also of Alana Newhouse's recent article. Did you read this? Zionism for Everyone. The thing that Zionism has is a very strong national identity. That's the affront to this worldview.
Yeah. The Jews who aspired to be a nation actually came from very different cultures, spoke very different languages, and had very different ideas of fundamental things like gender relations. So you had to create a unified society with strong solidarity from a fabric that was characterized by differences. And diversity is only a strength after there is unity. I pluribus unum. First, you need to have unity enough to create solidarity, and then variations within it can be a blessing. But think of the term multiculturalism. It means that you don't have a common denominator, a culture that is a common denominator at all. And without it, you would not create solidarity. This is how we don't create solidarity, through abstractions of what human beings are and their universal individual rights. Human rights are not a strong basis enough for actual solidarity. Solidarity is not based in abstractions, but in empathy. And to create empathy for a whole group, you need something that would unify it. Now, in the West, they teach you that the only thing unifying groups, or as they call it, tribes, or the tribal mentality, is the negation of another group. So enmity creates group identity. And that is a very shallow conception of culture, because mostly unity is created by tradition. And that is not the case of societies that are purely immigrant societies like America. Israel is an immigrant society, yet it had a common cultural root. So it didn't have the experience. It didn't have a common experience because people from Poland and Jews from Poland and Jews from Yemen were very, very different in any sociological metric. But they still had a common founding myth in the Exodus of Egypt and the story of the Jewish people. And so there was a potential unifying force. In the United States, the unifying force is projected on the future, and until the multicultural project, which seeks to divide, it was a success. America was a success story because its engine was a projection of hope on the future, and that was a very strong driving force. But then you had multiculturalism and the attempt to divide America by describing the center or the common, by describing, I even go as far as Judith Butler, solidarity is a form of oppression, because it erases the uniqueness of groups and that later individuals. But what the multicultural project did is it invented identity. What is Hispanic? How is that an identity? What is Asian? Are Chinese Mandarins and Muslim Pakistanis are of the same group? How? This was created by the Census Bureau. They created an identity, then they gave incentives, and they did this in order to generalize the experience of alienation from blacks to all other groups. The greatest success was, by the way, feminism.
You mean the the sense of alienation that black people felt out of the legacy of slavery in the U.S. Then they generalized it to other non-white quote unquote people.
Yes. If you look at the proponents of the different groups, they created from themselves a narrative of oppression by hegemony. And if you look at Barack Obama in the 2020 Democratic Convention, what was his speech about? Well, all these dramatic pauses, silences, and then pauses in the middle. He said every group that came here was spat on, oppressed, derided, humiliated. The blacks, the Jews, the Italians, the Irish, every group that came had to suffer this. And then you ask, well, who is the antagonist here? Who oppressed all these people? America did. It's an anti-American philosophy, and people don't study Obama's upbringing from socialist circles. There's a brilliant book, Stanley, Radical in Chief, about how Obama matured in socialist circles in Chicago, anti-Semitic circles too, by the way, and this is I remember when he was first elected, I heard people saying that he is the president of the third world, not the United States. And I thought, I didn't understand it in the beginning. And only as his policy evolved, and I think the first station was the Cairo speech, right? In which America is apologizing before the world and the arrogance of power. And then later the appeasement towards Iran, then I gradually realized that this was the first Edward Saadian president. This is the president representing the philosophy of Columbia University, where he studied and Edward Said taught. The Democratic Party has since given itself over to this, right? It's a project in which the common denominator is considered oppressive, and so we welcome immigrants. We apologize. We want reparations for oppressed groups. We want to dismantle the oppressive binary of gender identities. And this is all a Foucauldian project of dismantling the common and fighting against solidarity. And when I was less of a conservative, I thought that even in socialist terms, this doesn't make sense. Because even socialism was about creating a new form of solidarity. Socialism originally said that nationalism is divisive and class it creates solidarity. You should unite with the workers of all other countries.
Workers of the world unite.
Workers of all countries unite, I think, was the original formulation. And when you get to Judith Butler and you get to identity politics, then consensus is the enemy and divisiveness and difference is the cure. We respect differences. I remember reading this book by, I adore her, by Christina Hoff Sommers, who calls herself the factual feminist. The book is called Who Stole Feminism? And she said, when I was a professor of gender in the 80s, we had an agenda and we knew what it was. It was the ERA and it was the civil rights and it was other things like that. And then she said in the 90s, I came to a conference in, I think it was Texas in 92. She said the whole conference was about the divisions of group. And this is why when you look at multiculturalism, it seems to be about group solidarity, but it's actually about individualism. It has one commandment: thou shalt not define me from the outside. This is why transgenderism is the end product of it, because even my sexual identity would be up to me completely.
Gender
identity would be completely up to me. And she said,
and it gets to the point of even my sex is up to me, the biological reality of sex.
Exactly. And so she said when they came to this conference, she said, and I'm improvising, but I think it's pretty close to the end, the group of Jewish overweight women whose sexual identity was in transition divided into allergic and non-allergic, because the allergic said that those who come with dry, cleaned clothes are creating allergic reaction among those who are allergic. So you see, and when was this end? Because first there is feminism against the hegemonic discourse was supposedly masculine. Then there is black feminism, believing it's oppressed by white feminism, which doesn't take into account their unique experience. And then black feminism divides into straight and lesbian. And then it continued to divide. Why? Because thou shalt not define me from the outside. So any identity that includes more than one is oppressive. And in the end, even singular identity is oppressive. So I don't know what Foucault would think, but I think he would at least acknowledge that transgenderism is not a gender. It's a movement between genders. I think Foucault would not identify this as the end product of its philosophy, but a nice step forward.
Well, I think the end product could be seen as the they-them phenomenon. The people who consider that they're neither male nor female.
I think Foucault would object to your analysis, Pamela, and would say that if your pronouns are the same in 2 consecutive days, then already you're trapped in an identity.
You made me think about the Pledge of Allegiance in the United States. Mm. When I was a child, we would all stand every day in school, face the flag, put our hand on our heart, and say the Pledge of Allegiance to the United States of America. And if you think about what the pledge actually says, it's exactly what you're talking about one national identity, about creating one national identity. And it's exactly what Israel has, that Western countries are struggling to maintain or recapture. Oh. The pledge says, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, for which the flag stands. One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That's what Zionism is. And that's the basic understanding of a national identity that's being lost in the rest of the West.
Exactly. Well, that was Intense.
Intense.
I don't know what it is with our conversations. I never planned to talk about any of this.
We never know where it's going to go.
Yeah, yeah.